I've never made a game before. I've made this, and whatever this is, but never a real game with a cool objective, an immersive story, or amazing gameplay. You know, the things that make games actually worth playing. So I'm a bit surprised to find myself in this position. I have an idea and a structure for a game that I'm actually passionate about working on, a game that I believe has real potential. How did we get here? Well, a few months ago, my buddy and I, let's call him Dave because that's totally not his name, we were hanging out on Discord when we somehow started riffing off some ideas for video game. The more we talked, the more serious and real the game became. Eventually, we had spent an hour talking and had a pretty cool idea. A 2D top-down game where you are an office worker, and every day you have to do your work tasks like filling out spreadsheets and talking to your boss and dealing with coworkers. Then you go home and sleep, then wake up and repeat, but slowly, as you sleep, you start dreaming. At first about pretty normal stuff like a conversation you had earlier that day, but then your dreams start to get weirder and weirder, and eventually you find out you can control your dreams. And then dream stuff starts seeping into your office life and everything becomes chaos. And it would be like an amazing crossover of Office Simulator and Stanley Parable, but even cooler, and there's a deep, meaningful message somewhere in there about how work sucks and life means nothing and... So where do we start? Well, Dave has a degree in computer science, and I studied audio and music, and I enjoy making art, so we felt we'd make a pretty fire two-person team. So we decided that every Sunday evening we'd meet up, work on the game a little, and slowly but surely, it would all start coming together. We did do that for about a month or two. We made some pretty cool stuff like this, and these, and Harold. We explored some cool programs like Sprite for 2D pixel art, Blender for making 3D assets, and Unity for, making the game. We were having a good time, it was fun. But still, we hadn't really begun the production of the game. It didn't help that Dave and I live 2 time zones away, and he has an actual job writing code for airplanes so that they don't crash. Meanwhile, I pour hot water on Bean for a living. Needless to say, I had a bit more free time than he did. I don't know why, but something in me gave me the urge to start putting some serious effort into this piece of art I was imagining. I made myself a schedule. Every weekend, I would plan out what day and time I would spend working on this game. And so far, 3 weeks in, I haven't missed a single one of those days. That's crazy for me. I can't even commit to finishing Game of Thrones. I thought, what the hell? Now would be as good a time as any to start sharing with the world what I've made during these past 3 weeks. To get into the nitty-gritty. The personal, the detail. Now, lots of devlogs graze over the nerdy, codey parts of development because they think it's boring or too complicated. You end up seeing these really cool coding time lapses that make it look like you're doing a bunch of work. But I think doing that skips over some of the most gratifying parts of making your game. If you're an experienced coder, 98% of the stuff I'm going to talk about will be super obvious, and hopefully it's at least somewhat interesting to see someone stumble their way through learning to code. If you have no coding experience, parts of this video might be like 4 inches above your head, but hey, if I can make sense of this stuff and you're interested enough to still be here right now, you probably think coding is somewhat neat. So I'm going to talk about code. Square one, start a Unity project. I started with the bare bone basics, like placing a character and having it move around, then having the camera follow him. I used a lot of assets Dave and I had already made just so I didn't have to look at a bunch of blank squares and circles. This was the code I had after my first day. 40 lines of code, most of them comments. Easy, right? Wrong. It took me like an hour of scouring the Unity documentation and forums just to find these methods and how to use them. And looking back now, it's like, yeah, obviously, just get the horizontal input, change the velocity vector based on it, and change the position. It's built in, it's easy, it's bad. Well, imaginary viewer who somehow has knowledge of game code without actually having experienced the process of learning development, here's the thing. When you don't know what the end is supposed to look like, it's really hard to know where to start. It's also hard to know what to Google to help you get there. It's a skill I'm still working on. Anyway, I added some backgrounds and decided I need to focus my time into a specific project to give me some guidance. The idea Dave and I had most thoroughly thought out was a minigame in the office, where you had to go to the water cooler and have a conversation with your coworker Harold about a bunch of mundane, boring office things like the weather, stocks, or Harold's boring children. But instead of directly selecting your response like in some other games, you would have to perform a word search. This seemed like a somewhat feasible first step for puny old bean water me with my very minimal coding skills. And one Sunday, while Dave was off at a wedding in Hawaii, I got to work. My first big milestone was implementing the trigger area for the cooler, so that when you walk near it, you can press E to speak with Harold. This alone took 4 or 5 days because I was still getting my bearings with Unity and C#. Essentially how it works, if the player enters the trigger area, give them the option to press E to start the minigame. It sounds relatively simple, but also includes things like detecting when the player presses E, or printing some text on the screen to show that the player even can press E, making sure that when they leave the trigger, they can't press E anymore. And then there's actually starting the game when you hit E, which is a problem I left alone for another week. Here's some technical hints if you want to do something similar. Both things that are interacting, in this case my player and the water cooler, will need a rigid body and collider to handle their interaction. Make sure isTrigger is on for the collider you want to be the trigger. Then spend some time looking into onTriggerEnter and onTriggerExit methods. Then I spent some time in Asprite making some new art like desks and a background for the menu. Oh, I need to make a main menu. God, there's so much stuff that goes into a video game. I made a completely new scene and spent some time getting the background to slowly scroll across it, then figured out how to make the play button actually start my game by clicking on it. Then I added some desks using Unity's sprite cutter and made the player run into them. Helpful hint, you can put multiple colliders on a single game object to construct some irregular collision boundaries. You don't just have to have square and circle.
Wow!
I imported some sick new assets, and finally thought it time to tackle my first real big challenge, the word search minigame. I've done a word search before, so I knew generally what I wanted it to look like, but didn't really know where to start. So I turned to the internet, like I have gotten used to, and found this gem of a forum thread that I just have to share with you guys.
So he said, I need help. I'm making a word search. I need help. And this guy said, yeah, just this is the logic behind it. He said, pick a random word, pick a direction, and then check to make sure it's legal, and then put the word down. And this guy responds with, the guy that asked the question, he says, thanks for the help, but I don't think it would help me out that much. I can get the gist of the logic behind the problem is the code, since I'm not completely sure how I should code it. And this random third party slaps back with the, does this mean you're asking us to code it for you? I'm guessing most people here have not done such a thing yet, but they would sit down and try to achieve it. That's the meaning of developing. Oh my gosh, he said, if you don't want to do it, you should look for another activity. It's fine.
The first thing I had to do was make a grid of letters, and I was super lucky to find there's a component called Grid Layout Group Component, which takes all of the children inside of it and makes a grid out of it. Super simple. So I made a model of what I want these buttons to look like and made it a prefab. Then for every row and every column, I would instantiate a button based on that prefab and copy the reference to that button into a matrix so that I could later pull it out when I was actually playing the word search. Then I'd assign the button a random letter and change the size of all of them to fit within the board. Making this took me about 8 hours, spread across 3 or 4 days. But I was starting to feel much more confident with my understanding of C# objects, components, methods, and all of the really basic stuff that makes you a developer. Next, I had to write a method so that I could place words into the grid. Originally, I had to give it the word, as well as a direction, and a starting point for the word. That would be pretty annoying to do for hundreds of, even thousands of words in the final game. So I made a list of words, and had the code go through the list, and for each word in that list, randomly assign it an origin point and direction, and then just do a bunch of tests to see whether it would fit in the board, or overlap with another existing words. Lots of debugging later, I got that working. All that was left was to let the player choose buttons, and then check whether the 2 buttons they chose made an actual word. The simplest way I thought to do that would be to give each word object its own first and last button. Then keep track of the player's first and last selections. If the selections you made matched up with any of the word's first and last buttons, then you correctly selected a word. All that's left is to disable those buttons, all the buttons in between them, and then make them red or something to show that you found them. To get one step closer towards the final version I had imagined, I attached a response to each word. If the word was found, I had the response displayed in text by the game board. This current state of the minigame is nowhere near its final form. I want there to be storylines and voiceover acting and cool art, but for now, I'm getting pretty far ahead of myself. It's hard to properly display how difficult this whole process is. Making just this shell of a minigame took a lot of time. I obviously do not yet have a completed, playable video game, but I have begun the long, arduous journey toward that ever-distant goal. It feels chaotic, but every small step I take closer to making it real, I'm reassured it's possible to finish this video game. Every developer on YouTube has given the same advice in one of their videos. Start with a small, achievable, simple game. I know that's probably smart to avoid burnout or losing interest in the project, or simply even being able to finish the game in a reasonable time frame. I know there's a trade-off. I can either spend a bunch of time creating this complicated original idea, sacrificing my time and sanity, or settle for a more basic game with less story and gameplay, so that I can actually finish the thing. To be honest, I don't really know which one I'll choose. For now, I'm just enjoying the creative and technical process, and thought it might be fun to share that with the world. If you want to keep up with this journey, subscribe. You have to do it. I'm not moving on until you do. And I heard somewhere on the internet that the longer I spend talking about you subscribing, the more likely you are to do it, so... Also, while you're down there, hit the bell. If you want to keep up with this journey, and to watch me grow as a developer, I'd love to have you along for the ride. You can send emotional support and give coding advice, or just bounce some ideas off me in the comments. We're just getting started, so buckle up, kiddos, and thanks for watching.